Okay, so now let's talk about war crimes and the ICC. So we heard this in PBD's interview where he's basically saying that he was charged with war crimes. There was supposed to be an investigation into their legal system to make sure that they were actually investigating any claims of ill intent in terms of what their military, what their soldiers were doing. And this guy, Ahmad, he was supposed to come. He canceled the day of. And then the next thing he did was issue war crime charges against Netanyahu and somebody under him. And so this was problematic, he was saying, is because this guy is just doing this to get out of his own legal problems and his legal troubles. And so what he is essentially saying is that these war crime charges are not valid. Now, this is where we get into proportionality and the laws of war. So because Israel is claiming that Hamas is a threat to basically Israel, all of its people, there are 7.2 million people in Israel from what I was able to confirm. And basically what he is saying is that all 7.2 million people are at risk. And because 7.2 million people are at risk, if you compare that to the number of people who have died, I think the number is around 64K. Obviously, those numbers are going to be disproportionate. There's way more lives at stake if Hamas is able to attack Israel or harm Israel or go after Israel. So they're going to say that we're saving 7.2 million lives at the expense of 64K lives. And so obviously if all 72 people are killed, then that is going to be disproportionate. Long story short, what I'm saying here is that when they talk about 7.2 million people being at risk of being attacked or threatened by Hamas or any other terrorist group, they're essentially saying that any number under that is always going to be proportionate because that number is much lower, right? So when you look at the issue that way, it is easy for Israel to say, hey, we're not committing a genocide. We're actually harming a lot less people than would be harmed if Hamas had its way and was able to enact terror on Israelis. Now, when it comes to laws of war, I do think it is a little bit problematic that this seems to be kind of open to interpretation. So I understand that whatever decision is made from a military point of view, that needs to be done in a way that is proportionate to any advantage that you would get if you were to take said action. And so obviously it's not really a numbers game, but it's just about what information that person had at the time that they gave an order or made a call. You're mainly just looking at what was known at the time that the order was given, right? And so I think in that sense it's difficult because you're not playing a numbers game. You're just trying to see like, hey, if we target this building and there's 10 people that we need to kill in there and we get those 10 people, whatever kind of happened is going to be worth it because we eliminate the threat of those 10 people. And it can vary, I guess, depending on how many civilian deaths there are. If there's 3, it may not be as big of a deal. If it's 10, maybe still not because it's 10 for 10. But if it's 10 people that you're trying to attack and it ends up in 300 civilians being killed, I think even that is a numbers game, but it's still open to interpretation because of whatever you can say those 10 people could have potentially did if they survived, if they were not targeted and all of that stuff. And so it does become confusing when you talk about the laws of war when it comes to how actions are perceived, because there are some people who are saying, this is a genocide, you're targeting Hamas, but you're targeting Muslims, you're targeting Palestinians, and then they're saying, no, we're just targeting a terror group, we're trying to protect our people. And so obviously there's different sides of the issue and people seem to be working with different definitions of what they consider to be a genocide. And the other thing they talked about was the idea of journalists being killed. And so what Netanyahu was saying is that there are some journalists who are actually part of Hamas, so they're not real journalists. They're talking about this camera that was basically shot down. This was at Nasser Hospital, and basically there was a camera that was put up by a journalist, and this is where a bunch of journalists were gathering. They had cameras up, they were recording what was going on. This was their meeting place. And so what some people say is, hey, this camera had a white cloth over this was a known journalist camera. But Netanyahu is saying, hey, this camera is a threat to us because it's recording troop movement, it's giving away our position, that sort of thing. And so they shot the camera down. And then additionally there's talk that this was a double tap and they potentially hit the hospital up to 4 times. crime. So this is problematic because you are shooting down this camera because it gives away your position and all of that stuff, but what was the end result? How many people died as a result of you targeting that hospital? And I believe they said that this was an accident and they did not mean to target a hospital. But then in this interview, he's also talking about how there are public places where civilians go that Hamas is taking over and making their command post, and that is why they have to target these public spaces. And so what it essentially amounts down to is that there's no safe place for civilians in Gaza. They are in danger either way you slice it. And he also talked about how there's underground tunnels for Hamas. And if you're thinking about it in that sense, Hamas is operating underground. You could easily clear out the people above ground while they are down there. But it seems like they're just really trying to focus on getting whatever they can that's underground. And that is them targeting civilians as a result. And so it's very complicated when you look into all of the different information about this issue, because there are a majority of people who see the issue the same way. This is a genocide, this is war crimes and all that stuff. But then there's people who are pro-Israel and saying that Israel has the right to defend itself regardless of what the outcome is of its actions. When you have this idea of a never-ending war or this enemy that you are constantly fighting, in that sense, anything can be justified. Anything can be casualties of war if you are always under threat and you are always being threatened. It just seems like any civilian deaths is just like, oh, well, that's just what it means to be in war. And so this is a very difficult topic to talk about when you kind of really break down what's going on and what the different arguments are.